Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Alex Elliott. I'm the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university located in San Francisco. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to On Practicing Divination with the I Ching. While I know we are all joining from different places all over the world, as a representative of CIIS, I want to acknowledge our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of what is now known as the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS's campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone. This acknowledgement is just one very small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our own community. And it doesn't begin to acknowledge all of the native lands, languages, and territories where you might be watching from right now or where you live and work every day. So I invite you to take a moment right now with me to acknowledge the land where you reside, and importantly, to commit to learn more about the Native communities near you and support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat where you're coming from or information about Native communities near you or their work, please do. If you're just getting started with this work, we always recommend native-land.ca as a starting resource. Now, before we get to the conversation, I have a few quick general tips and troubleshooting items to go over. If you are watching live tonight, we will be having a Q&A after the conversation, and you can participate by submitting your questions at any time using that web form, which is linked in the event description just below this video. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for after the conversation. We do have automatically generated captions for this event. You can toggle those on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. You may have noticed chat is enabled for this event, but please note it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see that chat. If you do choose to participate, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn that chat off at any time, and we really encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having any issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you're still having issues, it can really help to adjust your audio or video settings right within YouTube, and it can often help to lower the video quality. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Susan and Benebell, and then we will get right to their conversation. T. Susan Chang has been reading tarot for 27 years. She is the author of The Living Tarot, Connecting the Cards to Everyday Life for Better Readings, Tarot Correspondences, Ancient Secrets for Everyday Readers, and 36 Secrets, a decanic journey through the minor arcana of the tarot. She created and hosted with Mel Meelan the Fortune's Wheelhouse Esoteric Tarot podcast, which explores imagery and symbolism in each card of Golden Dawn-based decks. Besides her work in tarot, she is the co-presenter of Godsong, 365 Days with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, an online course with Jack Grail. She writes occasional cookbook reviews for NPR and is the author of the 2011 food memoir, A Spoonful of Promises. Benebell Wen is an occultist born and raised Buddhist with deep family ties to Taoist mysticism as practiced in southern Taiwan. She has taught I Ching divination, Taoist metaphysics, and East Asian modalities of mystical practices for over a decade. Benebell has been a featured keynote speaker on various metaphysical and occult topics at national and international conferences. Her other works include The Tao of Craft and Holistic Tarot. Benebell is a corporate transactions attorney licensed to practice law in California and New York. And now it is my real pleasure to turn it over to Susan and Benebell.
Hi,
Hello.
Susie.
Hi, everybody out there. We're super excited to be here. We can't see you, but we love you, and we're very excited that you've come. Hello, Benebell.
Hi, Susie. I'm so excited.
This is amazing. I was just saying to Benebell before we came on the air that we literally saw each other less than 4 weeks ago in Florida, and we were at the time at a tarot conference drinking funky Buddhas. But tonight, here we
And
are
having
drinking.
dinner.
That's right. That's right. We're having tea and sparkling drinks. So first of all, just for fun, I just want to talk quickly and remind us that we are talking about Benebell's amazingly comprehensive book. It is incredible. It is full of history, methodology, interpretation, correspondences, everything you could possibly want. And it is amazing. And I've been loving it this entire week. So super excited to talk about it. Just very quickly, if there are those of you out there in the tarot community who have never seen us in person before, we thought we'd give you a quick guide as to how to tell us apart.
We get confused for each other all the time. I can't tell you how many tarot conferences, especially if I have glasses on in the mornings. I'm coming down the elevator, like, oh, T. Susan Chang. I'm like, oh, I wish, I
So
really wish.
embarrassing for everybody, and we feel bad, and it's awkward. But it's understandable that you can confuse us because we're both in the tarot world. We were both born on the East Coast. We're both ABCs, American born Chinese. We're both born in the year of the rooster, even more weirdly. We both had musical childhoods. We're both total nerds. We both have major placements in Aquarius. My moon, your rising. We both do a lot of tarot stuff. So, we're basically are the same person, but in order to distinguish us,
We
I'm
have
12
thick
years
hair
older.
too. We both have thick hair. Isn't that
We
crazy?
both have thick hair. Yeah. Benebell's much more youthful. Benebell is also a pseudonym, and T. Susan Chang is not. Benebell has a real day job as a lawyer, and I teach and write and do all sorts of kind of whatever I want.
Because teaching and writing are not real jobs. What?
Benebell speaks Chinese. I famously do not, but I do sort of speak ancient Greek. Benebell has like a million Libra placements, and I'm like the flaky Pisces rising. So now you've got it. You're all set. So let's get to talking about you and the I Ching. First of all, I would love to know what your relationship with the I Ching was when you were growing up.
I think my own impression was always boring book of poetry that doesn't make any sense, and I couldn't really make heads or tails of it. But I saw my mom and dad using it growing up, and I thought what was really interesting was the polarity of how they approached the I Ching. My father treated the I Ching as a cultural relic. This is one of the most important books to being Chinese, to being Han, to being from the Yellow River civilization, and that idea that it's a cultural relic that we have to honor and venerate. And it's philosophy, it's spirituality, and it's actually ancient psychology to a sense. And then my mom treated it as a medium for communicating with God's spirits and ancestors. This idea of this is our tool for staying connected to all that is beyond in the spirit world. And so having that balance has always been part of how I've approached the I Ching.
And it's just always been around as well.
Yeah, it's always been around.
So in a sense, I mean, the book has been in the making your whole life, but when did you start actively working? Well, I guess two questions. One, when did you start actively working with the I Ching yourself? And two, when did you start writing this book?
So I would say technically in college, when I started taking Chinese classes, you know how you really wanted to, I was in Chinese school throughout my entire childhood, but then you really decide, you know what, I'm going to take learning Chinese and becoming fully literate in Chinese seriously, both traditional and a little bit more in the simplified Chinese when I was in college. And so one of those little personal projects to prove that I could, read Chinese was to try to translate the I Ching and work through the I Ching. So that was something I started, but I felt like I really didn't have any depth of anything, life experience, wisdom, knowledge of any other subject matter that you would need some at least surface level knowledge of in order to really have cultural context for the I Ching. And then I think around actually the full complete annotations were done before holistic tarot. And I just sat on it because I kind of felt really insecure with putting it out there because there was that question, why do you need another translation of the I Ching? And so I think I was very hesitant to put it out there. Who am I to write this book? And then it wasn't until I think after Tao of Craft, I started feeling a little bit more confident. And I think, how Asians, we do overkill, right? So I think I overcompensated. I was like, well, let me just like do an insane amount of research, go to China, go to Beijing, like get all the things and really sit down. And then if I'm really sitting in research, then I feel a little bit more confident about putting my work out there. So that's how the final text happened in 2023.
That's amazing. So, when you looked around at all the other I Ching versions and editions there were, what was it that you most wanted to see, what gap did you want to fill by doing your own version?
Probably something, it's going to be a very Libra answer, I think. I think just balance, finding the middle path, because I think what you see out there, right? It's either an unverified personal gnosis or it's, ivory tower academic rigor, and it's treating it as, just a very academic treatise of the text. Or you have a native Chinese person who's doing the translations, but may not have as strong of a grasp on, English language sensitivities to really do the English translation justice because they're speaking English as a second language. Or you have somebody who's speaking Chinese as a second language, where they don't necessarily have the Chinese, especially Guwen, the sort of the context and the cultural sensitivity that a Chinese native would have. And so for the first time, the hyphenated experience of being Asian American, right, was perfect. And then also you have either they're an occult practitioner or they're an armchair occultist. And just finding that middle ground between the two, I think, was why I finally decided maybe I can write this book.
Not only that, not only could you, but you actually are kind of the perfect person to do it,
Still to be, jury is still out on that.
It was your fate. It was your fate. So, I guess I'm curious to know, when you're famous in the tarot world, of course, for having written Holistic Tarot, and you've done an enormous amount of keynote speaking at the conferences. Everybody knows Benebell for tarot.
As have you.
And so I want to know, when you're in need of divinatory services, do you turn first to the I Ching or do you turn to tarot?
If it's a question that I would ask a friend for advice, I'll turn to the tarot. If it's a question I would ask family for advice, I would turn to the I Ching.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I don't think that's like a universal. I wouldn't use that as like advice for everybody. I don't think it's a one size. I think it's really specific to our cultural experience and life experience. That's why, because you know what I mean? Like I feel like tarot is the American, it's like my Western upbringing. But then I think the reason I turn to the I Ching for questions I would ask my family members is because of that cultural connection. So I don't think it's like this advice you would give as one size fits all. I think that's just something really unique to, well, not unique, but like specific to having our cultural experience.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book itself. A lot about the book itself. It just occurred to me, what is the hexagram on the cover?
Was it 30, I think? Oh, it's that fire over fire. I can't remember off the top of my head. I remember
I'm just
because
curious. I'm sure there's a reason for it, is what occurred to me. But more importantly, the I Ching is known as the Book of Changes. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why that concept of change is so central to this work.
The word "yi," right? So I went into a database of pre-Qin Qing Huang. So Qin dynasty is a very sort of important milestone. So pre-Qin texts, and in the database of all pre-Qin texts that use the word "yi," and I got more than 5,000 hits back, and I was going through it to try to get a summary or synthesis of what the word "yi" meant in context. So I could understand why this book was called I Ching, right? I Ching. And so it's interesting. It does mean change, but I think when we think of change, I don't know what necessarily the Western perspective is, but in terms of how we're viewing it, it's exchange. So there's a cause and an effect. And so change means something has to happen for it to then move. So there's that. But then there's also the internal change. So there's the stillness on the outside where there is no motion or notable movement, but the change is happening within. And so that's what E means. E is also used as a virtue. So it's often used in the context of saying you want to have this as a virtue. And the virtue is to be like water, to be fluid. So that's where
Mm.
that word comes in. It means, basically, you're right, it does basically mean change, but it is to change within the scope of your own nature. And if you read throughout the text of the I Ching itself, many of the passages kind of keep going back to that theme of, not doing anything and staying within the scope of your nature, but then within that scope of of your nature, being heavily active and still changing.
Mm, interesting. And that there's a notion that where everything is always in change.
In
Everything is
change, in
always in
flux.
flux.
Yes.
There's no stasis. Right. Okay. So one of the things that I was really interested in learning a little bit more about was the idea that there's these, two different schools of thought in terms of interpretation. That there's the image and number versus the
上述派,
meaning and principle,
义理
which
派.
reminded me a lot about various debates we have in tarot. But I wonder if you could do a quick sort of, rundown on what those are for us.
The image and number lineage.
Hmm.
So the image and number school, I think of that as just metaphysical correspondences. That's the easiest way that I can think of it, right? It's in a way, it's also scrying into the actual literal image that you see. And so one of the really interesting things right there that you immediately see is a difference in philosophical approach to what we'll use, like right brain, left brain, or like logic versus intuition,
Yeah.
because you don't think of scrying in the same sentence as an analytical, like two correspondences, right? Because
Yeah.
correspondences feel like you're calculating something, and then scrying feels extremely intuitive and fluid. And yet in this particular school, you're merging the two and saying the two are somehow related. And so
That
it's a
was
really,
fascinating to
like, the
me. Yeah.
Western mind cannot necessarily grasp that, but that's how we're lumping it together. So it's this idea of just working off the actual 64 hexagrams, looking at the line changes and what the line changes mean, understanding the implications of a dark line versus a light line, how that works, what the trigrams symbolize. All of that goes into how you interpret it from an image and number perspective. The other one I think of as literary criticism, 义理派. So it's this idea of, well, what did the experts say? What did Confucian scholars have to say about this text? What's the history of what this text says? What are the authoritative voices?
It's more Talmudic.
Exact. Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. And then you
Yeah.
look at the line text itself. So now instead of looking at the visual, the actual hexagram, you're looking at the line text associated with each of the lines and reading that. Well, how was this historically and culturally, interpreted? It. What does X, Y, what does Wang Bi say about this? What does this person say about it? And that's how you
I
then
see.
arrive at an interpretation.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, because we do, at least in the tarot world, we kind of created a distinction between correspondences based, which is like, Five of Cups, it's like Mars in the first decan of Scorpio, et cetera, et cetera. Versus it's, oh my God, there's this guy who's really sad and he, who's standing there on this card, and and I have an intuitive feeling about that. Whereas it sounds to me as though, when you're talking about image and number, that's the more intuitive one actually, versus meaning and principle being more like literary criticism, more like using secondary sources to like bolster an argument.
Or
Really
even when we
interesting.
use the word intuitive, it is intuitive because of that scrying aspect. And it's like reading clouds, it is kind of open-ended, but at the same time, because you have that metaphysical correspondences element to it, and each school of thought has pretty fixed, immutable, collective consensus of what they mean, consensus reality of what those correspondences are. It's also calculated, but then we don't say if it's a calculation, then it's not intuitive. I think we don't have that disparity that you do see in Western perspectives.
Right. That's fascinating. Well, to go on to another sort of famous dichotomy that, people, practitioners like us love to talk about, fortune telling versus divination. What's your opinion about the difference, just generally, and also specifically in the context of the I Ching?
I think what's interesting is, like I've said in the book, that my mom and I disagree on what, I mean, she basically thinks divination and fortune telling can be used interchangeably. She doesn't really understand why I cannot describe myself as a fortune teller. And I go out of, I take great pains to say, no, 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 what I'm doing is divination, or it's psychology based, or it's, I really feel like she thinks that I'm weirdly allergic to the word fortune teller, but she says what you're doing is fortune telling. And I don't know why you don't just own it. But then I don't know. I make a distinction between divination and fortune telling, but then again, because there is that disagreement, I think to each their own. So I think that's a great caveat
So in
to
your
lead
mind, what
with.
is that distinction? What is fortune telling?
Fortune telling to me is a skill. It's like musical ability. Some people have an innate inborn ability or psychic gift more so than others, but anybody who puts in their 10,000 hours can absolutely elevate their skill and ability and proficiency with fortune telling. I think of fortune telling as coming from the ego, not in a bad way, but it's myself, it's my own personal ability, it's something I'm capable of doing that I'm putting into the work. Whereas divination, I see myself more as a vessel. So first of all, because I'm a vessel, I have to be a particular kind of vessel. So now suddenly we're talking about, making sure I'm aligned in a particular way when it comes to astrological timing for when the vessel is being used as a vessel. The vessel has to be clean. Where the vessel is placed matters. The feng, all of these things matter because I'm kind of downloading in a sense, or I'm transmitting something that's beyond. And so the ego has to check out because there almost is this concept of a possession that's happening. And that's
Yeah,
where,
yeah.
right, that's where the power and ability or the knowledge is coming from. And so to me, I feel like that's a huge difference, at least in terms of perceiving
Yes.
where the information is coming from. So because I have such a big distinction between how that information is retrieved, I do make that, distinction between fortune telling and divination.
Interesting. I don't personally have a problem with being called a fortune teller because I think it's campy, but I do have a problem being called a psychic. And I think it's similarly, people have expectations of what that means. And I don't want to fight with those expectations or get people confused. So, although I do also agree that everybody has psychic abilities, everybody can do this work with a little bit of effort and commitment and interest, so yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, really. And I also think that, when you talk about how uh you have to be in a particular state of mind, you have to be, and your circumstances have to be right. I think that that's something that people often miss about those of us who do oracular work. Most of it is getting out of the way, you know, and making yourself a channel or a vessel for whatever it is to come through. And actually, it's not about you and your glamour as a psychic or reader or whatever. It's really more about what's coming through you and what's helpful to the person you're trying to help.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
think when I'm a
Yeah.
fortune teller, I feel like I'm taking up space, like the feeling that I'm occupying space. That's the feeling that I get. Whereas if I'm
Right.
serving as a diviner, I feel like I'm checking out as much as possible, and like the work that I'm doing is to check out as much as possible and to let the possession happen. But so that's why I
That
think
makes
it's
a lot of
important.
sense, actually. Yeah. Actually, I'd like to talk a little bit, since we're talking about, this between the worlds kind of stuff. Let's talk about shamanism and magic a little bit, shall we? So, so I don't really have in fact, I have zero sense of classical Chinese shamanism in any respect. So, you have to be my guide here. But one thing I wanted to know was sort of like how the I Ching sort of relates to other magical practices and divinatory practices like wuxi and Taoist magic. And can you just give us sort of a very quick 2-minute overview of what we're looking at here?
So first, the word we're looking at is "u," right? And it's a particular, like, what it looks like. It's a very specific word, and then there's many different types of variations and derivations of that word and how we use that word. But the "u" is the most important, and how you translate that becomes contentious. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is often translated to shaman, and that's the word that we use because I think there are certain, like a checklist of things that we look at when we think of what the characteristics of an "u" is. And then we're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this seems to match this loan word over here, shaman. So let's just use the word shaman.
It's
But
what we've
then
got. Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes
Yeah.
people say witch, wizard, sorcerer. There's so many words out there, and I think it gets really complicated. But then if I say, ooh, I won't hit the SEO metrics because nobody knows what that word is. So I have to use the word shaman to get eyeballs on my work. So like there's that transparency. But like, yeah, ooh is the word that we're talking about when we say this. And in terms of the importance, especially cultural importance, Li Ziho, who is an I Ching scholar, he had said that the two most important aspects to the Chinese identity is one, the clan system, or the idea of clans and family name, and two, the shamanistic historical origins of our people. And so there's this idea of that, King Wen, Wen Wang, all of these Yellow Emperor, Fuxi, they were all shamanic kings. And so the first leaders of our people were shamanic kings, and you had to be a shaman or have shamanic abilities to even be king. Because if you can't speak to God, how the hell can you lead your people? So obviously you need to be a vessel for the divine. That's where the idea of heaven's mandate came from. You speak to God. That's why you can lead your people. And so it's so integral to who we are as a people. It's in our DNA that there's this idea of a select few who can speak and commune directly with God and these spirits. And so Wu, and also when you look at how Wu is used in context in all of these pre-Chen texts, the form of divination used is with stocks. So there's song, dance, and ritualized rites involved of some sort. And then there's all of these things you have to do to make sure the spirits and the gods are present. And then you use some form of dried sweetgrass or stalks to do the divination. And there were two types. Either you used oracle bones, tortoise shells, or you use these stalks. And that's, I think, where we get this idea of using stalks and yarrow stalks in the divination method for the I Ching.
Yeah, it seems like a really clear connection when you look at the evidence. Yeah, yeah. Speaking of King Wen, Benebell Wen, is there a reason you're Benebell Wen in particular?
This is where I can't wag my finger because you're older than me, and so I have to respect you because we are still
It's
Asian.
okay.
Still your
You really
party.
don't have to.
But like, it is so obvious that you don't know Chinese.
It's
Okay.
so obvious. Oh my God.
Okay, so Wen is actually my Chinese name. It's my real Chinese name, Wen.
Oh, okay.
But the character is Wen Nuan, like warmth, tenderness. And then King Wen Wang is the Wen, mean like arts and humanities, language arts, or that's the word. So it's
Okay.
two totally different words. But in
Good.
English, we translate it to WEN. So it does look like it's kind of just like a fluke that I wrote a book on the I Ching, but technically in Chinese, it's totally different characters.
Excellent. Excellent. Now we know.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so one of the things I love about this book is it's not just you don't just teach us how to do divination with the I Ching, but you also have all these practicum exercises scattered throughout the books, like, homework, worksheets, things we can do, like, to actually feel like we're learning and developing and not just have to freestyle our way through this book. So, and many of the practicum exercises in here are what I would consider magic as opposed to divination, because there's ritual involved, there's materia involved, there's invocations involved. So, in the context of the I Ching, what do you think? Where is the divide between divination and magic? What's your thought about the role of the I Ching in those two sides of kind of the same coin?
You know what's interesting, just in terms of growing up in that culture, especially in Southern Taiwan. So, for example, if I went to get a divination, there would be magical elements immediately in tandem adjacent to the divination, because after you get the divinatory result, they would give you actionable items to do, or you would need a talisman, or like, you're possessed by like a demon or something. And so you need to be exorcised. Like, there's always this like magical component to the divination. And so in my mind, I never really like separated the two out into like opposite ends of a room. It just seemed like once you did divination, you would receive insight as to what's going to happen. Divination is taking the temperature of the room, right? Like kind of like looking at a barometer of some kind. And then once you know what's happening in the world around you and you have a more panoramic view, past, present, and future, you got to do something about it. And so there is, of course, I think in the modern day, we think of it more as self-improvement. We have to do something for ourselves. A more traditional view would be you have to do magic and you have to be active. So once you see what's happening in the world, there's probably something you don't want, like something you don't like, something inauspicious. That's when you have to bring in magic in order to rectify what's inauspicious. So it's always has always been hand in hand to me. And if you go to like any part of Asia and get a divinatory reading, especially from those who are really immersed in specific lineage traditions, it's not going to be just a divination. You're going to get a divination. You're probably going to get like a prescription of magical things you need to do or buy more of. And we can get into like fraud, right? Like that's definitely an interesting question. But yeah, there's going to be like a magical component after the divination.
Yeah, in fact, some of the spells that you talk about, I was reading the Eight Immortals section yesterday, and I was like, this looks a lot like hoodoo. I mean, it's like, it's so simple. I mean, I think it's just the commonality between magic, across cultures, the fact that there is a material basis for it, there is a building up of energy for it, there's an intention that's involved, and of course, as innumerable Western magicians have said, for as long as there have been magicians, it's the art of change. So all of this seems very familiar. One other thing, though, that comes up is the idea. Well, I almost hate to say his name in the context of this conversation, but Crowley thought that the I Ching you mentioned was powered by spirit intelligences as opposed to something, more abstract and acausal like synchronicity. Um, so, so to what extent do you think it's useful to think of the I Ching as a vehicle for contacting spirit or spirits?
You know how we make that distinction. I see a lot of this. The Jungian approach is to see it as synchronicity. Synchronicity is the explanation for why divination works. It's this idea of two things that seem unrelated happening, like a coincidence of some kind that you observe, and it's like proof in the put. Like it's proof that there's something in an intangible spirit world and the physical world aligning, and that's the reason it works. And he talked about it as being acausal, and therefore it's outside the scope of cause and effect. And so synchronicity is outside of cause and effect. And then he uses synchronicity to justify how the I Ching works. But then the I Ching change innately is implying cause and effect. You may not know what that cause and effect is. It might be a very abstract past life. I mean, there's many ways that we can talk about cause and effect, but everything, at least according to I Ching theory, is fundamentally cause and effect. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah,
But
but spirit intelligences, though, what's your take on the idea that we're contacting spirit intelligences when we work with the I Ching?
I mean, I think it's to each their own. I feel like I am.
It's kind of a trick question.
I've never gotten the sense that I wasn't. And so even when I went the approach, in your 20s, you're like, oh, magic is not real. Even when I was like, oh, this is just psychology, this is just self-improvement, I'm just reading into it using self-reflection. I think even then, when I was so deeply anchored in that way of thinking, somewhere in the back of my head, I had that sense that, oh, no, 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 I like, there's another presence. I've called something here. I've done something to call something present, and that presence is what's kind of operationalizing everything. I've always had that feeling, but it is a religious perspective. It's not anything that's concretized.
It differs from person to person as well. I mean,
Exactly.
anyone who does this work cannot deny that there's a change in the atmosphere, and how you parse that or what you call it is almost arbitrary. But I would like for you to maybe give the Lady of the Nine Realms her due, explain who she is, why we might want to invoke her as a magical spirit.
Well, Zhoutian Xuanyi she's someone that I feel very close to, and I guess the part that I left out of the book is she's why I wrote the book. She's why I published the book. She's why I made it a two-part book, which is one part discourse, one part practicum, why it's also layered with one part cultural context, and the other part is the actual annotations. So it's like two by two. So it's kind of like bifurcated laterally and
Yeah.
bifurcated vertically to have that sense of a cube. And like everything that I did in it, and even like which practicums to put in there, how I was guided toward everything, like all of it for me was because of Zhou Tianxuan. And it was that sense of her being an emissary for Xi Wangmu, the Queen Mother of the West, and how these have always been sort of the go-to goddesses and patron goddesses for occult practitioners and Taoist mystics. And so I think that's the connection there. If you're into Taoist occultism at all, then I think you would, on some level, she would be your patron goddess.
Isn't that interesting? Wow. Wow. Okay, so let me ask you a little bit about this question. When we've touched on it a little bit of um I Ching's relationship to the West, generally speaking. You know, I mean, I think the quote I liked best, and I'm sort of showing my cards here, is one that you wrote on page 230, where you said, I emphasize that the I Ching is universal, transcending culture and history, available for anyone and everyone to access. So I just wanted to ask you to expand upon that a little bit for anybody who feels, you know, queasy, as people often do, about people from different places using a text that clearly belongs and originates in one place.
There are actually really interesting debates and conversations about even that culturally. Where does the I Ching belong? Because it was from the Zhou dynasty. Who were the Zhou
Mhm.
people? Were they Han? Because that's not an easy question to answer. So who were the Zhou people? Zhou is kind of like an empire, in fact. So Zhou was the unity of multiple tribes of people. And they were very, very different. Even when you read the text, they always talk about how different these people looked. And so why it was so great is because they united these really different people that were at war for so long. And so when you think about that, who does it belong to? Why is it someone who looks like us now saying it's
Mhm.
culturally ours? And so I think that's a really interesting question to have. I don't think anybody can say they own it. And even if you take it from a legal perspective, legal philosophy, political philosophy, at some point, something becomes public domain. And so I just have, applying that
Yeah.
idea at this point, it's public domain.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And would you just for a moment in your, you know, in your best Chinese, pronounce I Ching for people just those who have felt slightly unsure or nervous about it? Go for it.
易经
Yay. Okay.
Beijing, but then
So,
I
yeah.
don't get worked up about how you pronounce it because if you think about even in different languages, Japanese, Vietnamese,
Yeah.
they pronounce there's like different words for it. They use their own wording for it. And so, and even
Mhm.
Taiwanese versus because I was asking my dad, how do you say I Ching and Hakka? Like it's so
Oh,
different.
do you? Do you
Igim,
remember?
yeah, Igim, yeah, it's Igim.
Wow.
And I
Uh-huh.
remember how I remember the pronunciation, the Hargao. So I was like, oh, Hargao, Igim. So like that's how I remember it. Like, it's like ordering food from dim sum. But like,
Everything
yeah,
revolves around food,
everything
as
is
far as
food for sure.
everything
But
is
like,
food.
yeah, so when you're speaking English, I say I Ching.
Yeah.
I don't suddenly switch to Chinese and go blah 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 I Ching, and I say yin and
Right.
yang. If I'm
Yeah, yeah,
speaking
yeah.
Chinese, I say yin yang, but then like I still say yang when I'm
Just the
speaking
same way we say
English.
taro instead of taho, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have to have a little bit of latitude.
Mhm.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, so let's get into, I want to make sure we get into actually using the book, because this of course is the heart of the matter, how we can avail ourselves of all your hard work. So first of all, methodology. You offer in the book several several different approaches to using the I Ching, the coin toss method, the yarrow stalks method, even a grain of rice method. What's your view in terms of like Are they all equally effective? Does it matter?
Um, I I think one way to answer that is yes. I think so because what's meant to be will be. And I do believe, even though it's all equal access, I do believe the occult technologies gatekeep themselves. And
Mm.
so to that extent, you can do whatever you want to do. If it's not meant for you, it's not meant for you. You can kind of be a little bit more effortless. If it's your parent, they will always be sympathetic and lenient and liberal with their own child. If you are a child of this particular spirit, you're given a lot more latitude to be an
Mm.
asshole. And so I kind of feel the same way when it comes to the I Ching. So if it's meant for you, it's meant for you, and you can use any method at all. For me, I find that there's something about the Yarrow method because it is like, even if you look at how you do it, the mathematics of it, every
Mhm.
single number in that concept, in the process itself, is deeply meaningful to the process and to the cultural relic itself. And so for me, it helps me change state of consciousness in a way
Yeah.
that is almost methodical. Whereas if I'm using ritual or, ceremonial magic, sometimes you're in it, sometimes you're not. But I find that there's something really accurate and reliable about the 50 stock, 49 stock method, where as long as I follow that path, something happens to me.
And something happens to you in the sense that you feel a shift of consciousness in a way?
Yeah, I think it's also the visual way you do it, where you have to like
Mhm.
pull it apart. You're taking one bundle, you pull it apart. There's one that's the ego or the ooh, right? So that you have
Mhm.
to have that the significator. So you already have a significator stock, and then the idea that you pull it apart, and then how you have to put one down where you heaven and earth, and then you're connecting heaven and earth. And then even that looks like the character for ooh shaman. Like the
Mm.
formation itself looks like the word for shaman. And then the way
Mhm.
you do it, the fours, like every aspect to it is so carefully thought through by our people, if you will, that I
Mhm.
just find that just doing the thing that my ancestors and my ancestry has done for at this point almost 3 millennia is what I think is why I can change states of consciousness.
I love that idea. And I think also because it's so, it's so time consuming. It forces you to really, I mean, it gives you time for the transition from one state of mind to the other. Whereas I think if you're just tossing coins, which is a lot faster, it's over and it's done. I mean, I have that problem with tarot all the time, which is that, it's so easy to get an answer. Like you literally just flip a card and you can look at it in 5 seconds and think
Mhm.
what it's trying to tell you, when quite often there are further layers that it would be worth your while to consider. So I also like the way when you walk the reader through the Yarrow divination, you point out that sort of each time you kind of reorient yourself and revisit the question and kind of, you know, align yourself again. And I think that that's incredible to have that, built into the process. Yeah. So do you, do you ever, you know, personify the I Ching? Like, I often will say, tarot says, according to tarot, and I don't know exactly what I'm doing when I do that, but I definitely sometimes feel that there's a personality that I don't know whether I project it, create it, whatever you want to call it, about the cards. And do you do that with the I Ching?
I would say absolutely, to the point where I mean, it's become in a way a third parent. The way I approach my relationship with the oracle is
Mhm.
very similar, I would feel, to how I approach my relationship to a parent or to like an
Mm.
ancestor that I see in front of me, or like my grandmother. If I were to be in the same room as my great grandmother right now, how I approach my great grandmother is kind of how I approach the I Ching. I definitely
Mhm.
personify it. I feel like sometimes if I'm not putting my all in it, I will like kind of get shushed by the oracle. You know what I mean? Like I sometimes you get these really tough love answers. It just really does
Yeah.
not mince its
Yeah.
words. It's not like each the tarot where sometimes you can kind of read a love and light, happy, positive, and optimistic patina from the reading. Sometimes the I Ching won't even let you do that. It's like very like, ooh, ouch, like what, And so you get these like readings. But then to be fair, I know that sometimes in the depths of profound grief, when I really need someone there for me, the tone has been like nurturing and helpful. And so that's how I feel like I perceive for sure there's a personality, because it knows exactly when, okay, she really needs me to be there for her, so I'm going to be there for her. And when she's being a little, a little whatever, so I'm going to, put her back in her place. And so I feel like I do get disciplined by the oracle.
That's really that's really funny, and I think true to the experience for any of us who do oracular work. Um, Now, what about formulating a question for the I Ching? Like, when I tell people who don't have any experience with tarot to formulate a question, I have sort of a base formula, which is like what would be useful or helpful for me to know about whatever the thing is. Do you have sort of a base formula for a question for the I Ching?
The traditional perspective, because I think it is different, right? I think today we
Mhm.
have a softer sensitivity around these things, but then I think a more traditional perspective and actually a more native practitioner perspective would be, so two parts. Step one, you can ask anything. There's no holds bar. There's this conceptual theoretical idea that you can ask any question at all. Also,
Mhm.
be careful what you ask. Do you really want to know the answer to that? Right.
Yeah.
And so there's this
Yeah.
idea of there's no sense of like, these are the rules for how you frame a question. You can ask your question and frame it however you like. But at the same time, I think over the centuries, we have these schools and traditions that have built up guardrails and codes of conduct around how you can approach questioning the oracle. And that really varies depending on the tradition that you're looking at. But we have guardrails for, some traditions, some schools will say you can never ask about death and life. Others, obviously, especially in Chinese culture, fortune tellers were always like, when will I die? And so it really
Yeah.
depends on what tradition
Yeah.
you're approaching the I Ching with. But yeah, I would say that's the traditional approach. Be careful what you ask, but you can ask anything. There's no parameters around how you must frame your question. I think in today's world, I think asking a more open-ended question is how we, because of how we've been socialized, can better induce self-reflection. And I think that self-reflection then induces a particular state of access to consciousness that can draw down something or to pull up something that you otherwise were not as aware of. So that's why I think it has
Mhm.
changed over the years, but it's more
Mhm.
because culture has changed over the years.
Yeah, so you feel that a more open-ended, question is more suited to a modern sensibility, I guess.
Right. But then also, I
Yeah.
think more Western modern sensibility. I
Yeah, for
think if you
sure.
look at
Yeah.
Eastern fortune telling traditions, they ask like yes or no, auspicious or inauspicious. Like it's so
Oh, I
specific, right?
know, I
Like what will my
know.
husband look like? It really depends on the
Yeah,
culture.
it really does, and, and we here in this country, in the in the divination community are very, very, used to open-ended questions and people being, open to that, and, I just remember the first time someone came to me and was like, "Will I get a 90 on my nursing exam?" And I'm like, "What?" But, for some, depending on where you're coming from, that's a completely legitimate question for the oracle, so
And I would actually say if you read the text of the I Ching, it seems suited for yes or no questions because so
Yeah,
many of the verses are
yeah.
auspicious to proceed, inauspicious to proceed. So I'm like, okay, this seems like it's implying you would ask yes or no questions.
Yeah, it does kind of. So let me ask you a little bit about how do you hope to see people using this book? As people, and I guess I'm thinking because I hope that this book sells millions of copies and makes it deep into the mainstream. So I assume it's going to find people who have never used the I Ching before, and where would you suggest that they begin?
Where would they begin? I think it depends on what you're interested in. And
Mhm.
so, for example, my husband James, so
Mhm.
he really was not interested in the divinatory aspect, the oracular aspect. You go at it with that approach. He's not interested in the I
Yeah.
Ching. But then he read my chapter on the cultural context and the history of what happened in the Zhou dynasty, the Shang and Zhou dynasty, that battle that the I Ching was born out of. And when he read that chapter, he was like, "Oh, that's really interesting." And then now he was interested in the I Ching as a cultural relic. And then
Mhm.
other people are like, I'm really into psychic phenomenon and mysticism. So I really want
Yeah.
that aspect of it. And so I think it really depends on what you want. And I
Yeah.
hoped to write a
Yeah.
book that had a little, had a gateway or an entry point for no matter how you wanted to approach it. And I think the
Yeah.
reason I did that more particularly was because I wrote this book after I finished writing this book. I know what I felt. I finished writing the book. The research was, wow, I'm really proud of being Chinese, of being Han. Like I'm very proud of my culture and my heritage, which
Mhm.
I can say I didn't always feel at every point in my life, especially growing up in this country. And so knowing how I felt after knowing like my culture produced this. And so I hope to be able to give other Asian Americans something that they can feel that same way, that pride that I felt after I finished this book.
I'll let you know. Yeah. So, well, let's imagine Asian American or not. Let's imagine that you're someone who just wants to start right away, get their hands dirty, start doing divination, get some answers to your pressing problems because everybody's got them. Where should they start? Should they turn straight to the divination, to the divination methods section? Should they get some coins? Should they? What do you think?
Even simpler than that, I say use it as bibliomancy. You see that part that's shaded? That's the actual text. Use it as bibliomancy, and then use that as your entry point into a rabbit hole. I think,
So the
yeah,
shaded part of it is where all of the definitions for the 64 hexagrams are. Mhm.
as simple as you can do it. And then how did that feel? What did you like? Did that open up your curiosity? And I think from there, we become very self-motivated to find out other answers. And then, okay,
Mhm.
once I've done that, well, what's the traditional way? I think of that as tarot. I think the first time I used the tarot deck when I was, 12 years old, I wasn't doing the opening of the key. I was just pulling a
Yeah.
card and looking it up in the little white book and making up my own answers.
Yeah.
But something in me clicked because if it's meant for you, it's meant for you. And then you yourself will be driven to find ways to learn the more traditional methods or go as deep as you want to go. So I don't have I don't chart out anything for anybody. I think just go at it and then find your rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge book, obviously. And you're saying I don't have to read every page of it from beginning to the end.
No, not at all. It's like it's more of a reference book. I hope
Right.
that
You
it's that
use
you
what you need, right?
there's
Yeah.
multiple entry points.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Okay, so I think since we're getting short on time, I want to take you through a reading that I did this morning, or ask for your advice about a reading I did this morning, or this afternoon rather, um, with yarrow stalks, which were given to me by Mel Meline, the wonderful deck creator with whom we both know and love, and who was my podcast co-host for a long time. Anyway, she had given me yarrow stalks from our area, like for my birthday a few years ago, and I rarely use them. And I thought, now is the time. This is the day. And so, um, unfortunately, I noticed when I was like consecrating them and taking them out and being nice to them and everything that I only had 49. So, so I got a stick of incense to use as the 50th one, which seemed kind of appropriate.
Perfect.
Um, so the question that I asked, because I wanted to come up with a question that was not just about me, but like, which I thought would be helpful to many of our listeners who are here with us tonight. And I thought, well, we are living in a time when there's multiple sources of anxiety, whether it's, war, or whether it's climate change, or politics in the country you live in, or COVID, or, there's all these things that are likely to make us anxious in one way or another. So, this year, 2024, I said, what would be helpful to our listeners who may be experiencing political slash geopolitical, existential anxiety in the year 2024? And after a good 45 minutes, because there was a lot of like recounting and not being sure I did it right, I finally did come up with the hexagram, which was hexagram 31, um, which is now I can't remember what is over what, but you probably know.
Yeah, and Lake over mountain.
Lake over mountain, yes. Uh-huh. And then two of the lines, lines 4 and 5, were changing lines. So the hexagram you would then that it would be transformed into would be number 15, which is Earth over mountain, I think. Right. So, what
Modesty.
can you tell us about the answers that I received, and what can we take away from it when we face this year with nerves and anxiety?
So the approach you went with, how I would read it, I focus on line 4 and line 5 and use that as the connecting point, almost like common denominators, the pathway between the two hexagrams. And you have to, so because it's the book of change, you're reading the change. Change is the most important aspect, like you said. And so what you're reading, the divination, is the change. And I really like this opportunity to kind of show how like Chinese fortune telling might differ from a tarot reading. So in answering that question, using those hexagrams and how their trigram correspondences and the wuxing correspondences of the trigrams and how they change, especially where line 4 and 5 and the context of it, there, I would say there's 4 actionable items.
Mhm.
Actually six, but the 4 more important. So the first one I would say, okay, so what this is saying, when you have the hexagram 31 mutual accord, the idea of alliances, changing into hexagram 15, the idea of modesty. Chen, there's the state of dormancy has been going on for far too long. And so now you've become complacent to that state of dormancy. And now you need some way to get back out into reality. And what's funny enough, so line 5 has a famous Chinese proverb that qian qi mei, and qian qi mei means avoiding reality. So when you use that idiom or that proverb, it means you're avoiding reality. And so
And this
it's
is
really,
in the primary hexagram.
this is line 5 of hexagram 31.
Okay, gotcha.
And so it's just really interesting to see like that. That's sort of
Yeah.
the implicit idea of it. And then
That
when you
really
look at,
tracks.
I know, right? Isn't it? And so
Yeah.
it's this idea. Okay, so now that you're in this change, this stasis, how do you get out of that? That idea of all that earth energy, all that balance, but it's dormancy. So how you get out of it is divide and conquer. This idea of division. You need order, you need discipline, because metal, the idea of metal is one, it's music because you have the metal instruments, but it's also violence, unfortunately. So there's this idea of the sword, but it's also about cutting. Like if you think of the kartaga in Buddhism, the sword also cuts away ignorance. It cuts away what no longer serves. So there's the idea of that sort of the metal that comes into play. And then because it's that earth correspondence that was dominant, also something very simple as between the hours of 7 a.m. and 11 a.m., because that's the ascendant hour that corresponds with earth, intake of more nutrient dense foods. So just between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m., that's when you should be focusing on more nutrient dense foods to nourish your body. And if you start from that, everything else will kind of fall into place. And so that's how Chinese fortune telling works, whereas you don't necessarily see this kind of prescriptive divinatory readings when you approach a Western perspective of divination.
So like if we all stop intermittent fasting and being hangry at 11 a.m., we'll be nicer to each other and perhaps world peace will result.
Exactly. You can still do intermittent fasting, but there's this idea of that one ascendant hour in the morning that corresponds with Earth to have, that's when you want to focus on nutrition and treating your body as like an incubator and making sure all the nutrition that your body needs happens during that morning hour. So that's very interesting. Save, I think because of the correspondences that you see here, it's really good for love and marriage. So focus on love, marriage, and alliances. Alliances and partnerships are where you should adjust your mind in terms of reducing that anxiety. And what is probably not a good idea because of that, because of some of the elemental, I use the word elemental dignities to explain how we look at the alchemical correspondences here. But because of that, anything that has to do with wood and fire is not that great. And so, for example, high risk financial investments, extremely like ambitious undertakings for this year is probably not a fantastic idea. And so avoid high risk, be more save fiscally, be more conservative. But when it comes to being your heart, be more open and liberal with your heart. So like alliances, love, relationships, that's a good thing to focus on to reduce that anxiety.
Excellent. And so is that all based on hexagram 31 correspondences
And
or on
15, because you're
and
reading them
15
together. So
as well?
you would want to do the
I
synthesis
see.
of the two.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's good to know. And it's really remarkable that there's, that much information based on correspondences that
Mhm.
you can extract from them. But, suppose that someone doesn't want to go, or doesn't have the skills to go that deep with a reading,
Mhm.
is it valid and appropriate, would you say, to just sort of like go in there, read what there is, and just take whatever seems useful and relevant out of it?
Absolutely. So for example, we can do that right now looking at the line text. So we begin with the primary hexagram 31, right? So
Mhm.
line 4, essentially it's about overcoming imposter syndrome and cultivating conviction and confidence. So there's this
Mhm.
idea of the anxiety is coming from a lack of confidence and imposter syndrome. Like you've been dormant for so long, you don't actually know if you can socially engage again. You don't know if you can do the things that is out in the outer real world anymore because you haven't had to for too long. So there's some kind of cognitive dissonance that's
Ah,
happening and we don't
we've all
feel like
retreated to our corners.
we
Yeah.
have. And so that would be very actionable in terms of just overcoming imposter syndrome, finding the way to nurture and develop your skill of confidence. Confidence is absolutely a skill that you have to learn how to actively develop. So develop your confidence. And that's how I would read that. Line 5 is kind of another shush. This is when I kind of felt like it's kind of yelling at us and not being as kind. It's saying that our behavior is not lining up with our intentions. There's a disconnect between our speech and our actions. And so as a collective society, the oracle is
Yeah.
saying, what you say you want and what you're doing are not lining up. So, the bad things that are happening to you are kind of on you right now. So well, not to blame, but like, what I mean? It's this idea of, well, go back to yourself, truly reflect on, are you part of that collective that has a dissonance between your action and your words, or are you going to be the exception from the rule and actually align your intention and your and your action? So what you say you want, are you actually doing actions that reflect
Mhm.
what you say is your intentions or what
Is
you
there
say you will?
integrity? Mhm.
Integrity,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's that concept of the primary hexagram. Then you move on to lines 4 and 5, and you just read the line text for the secondary hexagram, hexagram 15. So there's the
Mhm.
idea of, so don't be, what's really funny, because if you think about the consecutive order of how you would read it, you just read line 5 of hexagram 31 that basically said, your behavior is not lining up with your alleged intentions. And then line 4 of hexagram 15 is, don't be offended when you've gotten schooled.
Ah!
Isn't that interesting? Because it's saying like, don't get
Yes.
offended or get
Yeah.
defensive when people are calling you out. So because that's kind of
Yes.
the vibe of line 4 of hexagram 15. And
Yeah.
then line 5, the actionable, like the actionable item to take away from the final reading. If you see collective suffering, then assert and do something positive about it. See something, say something. Because if you read the line, the translation, it's if your neighbor is not prosperous, then you're not prosperous. If you're not prosperous, your neighbor is not prosperous. The implication being, see something, say something. We all have to lift each other up. Don't just lift yourself up. Don't just navel gaze. If you truly want to lift you up, then you have to lift your neighbors up first. So focus on other people, focus on the greater good, and in that as an incidental benefit, you will be lifted up as well.
Those are wise words for everyone to remember and to act on as well, since, the taking the oracle is only the first step, right? After that,
Absolutely.
we have to act on it. Okay, I think it's time for us to transition to some questions. And I see that we have 3 already in the queue here. We have a question from Minta. Is there a historical relationship that exists between the 8 symbols of the I Ching and the 5 phases or elements paradigm of traditional Chinese medicine? Did one system develop from the other, or did they evolve independently? And if they evolved independently, did they influence each other in any way? And I can tell her right away that it's definitely in here. It's
It's
definitely in
absolutely
here.
related.
It's
So yeah, it's
definitely in here.
absolutely related. The when you think of the wuxing, 5 changing phases, they're like 5 forces of change. So we're categorizing the force of change in 5 separate ways. And then this force that causes things to change changes into 8 elements. And so these are more of it's like a periodic table of 8 elements. And that's what the 8 trigrams are. And then those trigrams then build, there's the idea of the binary that forms, codes. That's where the 64 hexagrams come from. And if you know math and, permutation and combination, it all checks out. Mathematically, it all checks out. It's kind of crazy. And even when I didn't think it checked out, I just asked my dad and he goes, "Oh, that's calculus." Is that crazy? Well, I go, "But 5 doesn't 4, like this doesn't go into that." But he's like, "Well, you're only looking at addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. You have to look at calculus." And he says something about quadratic functions. I'm like, wow, that's crazy.
It's great to know that that the math checks out, even if some of us are not going to go there. Okay, second question. Question from John. I would like to hear about the ritual use of the I Ching and how one builds a relationship with it, and how intuitive practices of interpretation can build with experience.
I think, well, ritual use of it is about showing up as a vessel. And I think it's a way of aligning your ritual, like the way we talk about dance and song as connecting us to a different state of consciousness, but also that state of consciousness is connection to God and spirit. And so we use music, we use dance, we use ritual, ceremony to connect us to something higher. You want to say higher self? I'm happy for you. That's fine too. And I think that's why ritual gives us that elevated experience. And then once you have that elevated experience, you can always reach into that because you know what that feels like. And that's how you build your relationship with God, with spirit, with the oracle.
That's a wonderful answer, I think, for all oracles, as well as not just the I Ching, but in general. Now we've got a question from Dominic. What are your thoughts on practicing I Ching without using a reference guide? Is there a system for that?
That would be the image and number tradition, where you'd have you extremely knowledgeable. So if you really know the system and you know how to do the math, then you don't need any consultation. So technically, you don't need that table to cross-reference the lower trigram and the upper trigram. That's for us like non-math people. We need that table. But if you're mathematically inclined, you can do it absolutely by yourself. And then once you have it, you scry into what it looks like. And it's pretty easy to memorize, especially if you do it a couple of times, what the 8 trigrams are, their basic correspondences, and then the Wuxing correspondence to the 8 trigrams, and then yin and yang, just the idea of what the correspondences are for a dark line versus a light line, using dark and light, which form the 4 seasons. Everything is based on that dark light concept. And so if you know all of that, you don't need a book. The book is actually more of a Ili Pai. It's more of that, what's it in English again? What's Ili Pai in? The other one, I forgot what it's called.
Oh, meaning and
principle. Meaning and principle tradition. So if you do that tradition, that's when the line text matters.
Yeah, good. Okay. Another question from John. Is it a good idea to have some secondary resources like other translations at hand? And secondly, what type of meditation can be effective with divination?
Yes, absolutely. I think I always like second points of view, third points of view, fourth opinions. And I also find that when you have multiple translations, you can start to synthesize it in your mind as well. So I do think it's really important. And because I do think that some of it can be unverified personal gnosis, but some people come from that academic point of view who have done the research. That's really important too, to be honest. And so I think having multiple sources is very important. I do show one form of meditation called guarding the one. I don't know where it is, but it's from one of the oldest Taoist lineage traditions. It's the San Huang, the 3 sovereigns tradition that is very steeped in Taoist mysticism and magic. So it's well known among Taoist mystics. They often use that or variations of the guarding of the one meditation in order to elevate themselves as vessels for divination.
It seems to me that meditation goes hand in hand with divination generally. I mean, the just getting yourself into the mindset to be receptive to divination is so much easier if you have some kind of meditation practice available to you.
I would make the argument that that meditation goes hand in hand with every aspect of what would help you bolster your life. For example, like this is kind of going off
Mhm.
tangent, but I often get asked the question, oh, how do you multitask? How do you do everything that you do? How do you manage your time? And at the end of the day, I always wonder, what is my answer to that question? It's meditation. It's the training and
Mm.
meditation that I've had. So when I do something for an hour, I'm 1,000% focused on that one thing. You cannot push me away from, like, literally, I kid you not, there can be an earthquake. There was like a 6 point something earthquake, and I'm still at my computer doing my work. I will, like, the house is shaking, books are falling. I'm just like, I got to finish this sentence. And so
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
focus comes from meditation training.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. Love the way y'all are tackling semantics and more. Thank you. Should science and religion be talked about in the same breath? Can they be combined, even with opposite modes of thought, or do they merely coexist? That's a big one.
I would say yes. And the I Ching, the concept of the I Ching itself is that when things mathematically check out, it's proof of God. And so we do put math and proof of God, divination in the same, like it's always been the same. And even the words that we use, like shu, like how you count, like the verbs that you connect with the subject is similar when you're using, when you're talking about mathematics and physics, as when you're talking about divination and magic in the Chinese language. And so seeing how we use the same verbs to talk about counting and math and divination and psychic ability is really, really interesting. So I would
Yeah,
say they
yeah.
are absolutely connected.
Absolutely. And I think the connection between number and the divine is all but universal. I mean, this is not unique to,
Right,
to
right.
Chinese culture, but yeah, I think that that's something that we lose sight of quite easily in the modern world.
And
Okay.
music is math, and music is also
Yes.
connected to the divine, music universal. This idea of music being proof of the divine.
Right. Right. Question from Dr. Zay. How do you think about using I Ching cards instead of traditional approaches like yarrow stalks or coins? Is there one method that you would recommend or that you love in particular?
Yeah, I absolutely think using I Ching oracle cards are fine. I think for me, it's more of a I can't get my head out of it because, oracle cards I kind of think of as being over here with tarot and then I Ching, but that's like a me thing. That's not a tarot or I Ching thing. That's like a me problem, right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
think absolutely the idea, like the premise and the theory of drawing cards at random is the same probability premise that you see in the I Ching divination methods that we've been talking about. So I think absolutely using a deck of cards Oracle I Ching can work. In terms of my favorite method, obviously I'm biased. It's going to be my trigram correspondences to the tarot cards and using that to stack and build hexagrams. And so you can use 2 cards in a tarot deck to then read and build a hexagram. And that's my personal
Which I
favorite.
did for the first time today with your Spirit Keepers deck. It was an amazing, amazing thing to do, and interestingly got hexagram 15 again.
It's
So,
crazy.
oh, actually, something I wanted to just throw in a question of my own really quickly. Is there like a difference between binary based systems like the I Ching or geomancy or and ones that are generally not, like most oracle cards and tarot? I mean, do you think there's something fundamentally different?
I didn't think I feel that if anything, tarot and Western astrology is more binary than the I
Mm,
Ching because the I Ching is not saying I am either yin or I'm yang. There's no such thing as this being mutually
hmm,
exclusive. The idea is, okay, look, there is a fundamental language built from zeros and ones. Everything in this world that stores, transmits data in this world or modifies data in this world is built from this code of zeros and ones, but it's a
mhm,
string. They're bit strings of zeros and ones. DNA is zeros and
mhm,
ones. This is idea of that's
yeah.
the binary, but I'm not either this or that. I'm a combination of that. So to me, the I Ching is
Mm,
non-binary. Whereas if you look at
mhm,
Western astrology, even the tarot, there's this idea that they borrow in from Hermetic philosophy, where there's that like masculine, feminine, active energy,
mm,
passive energy. And you
mm,
don't see it as something being built of a combination series of active and passive, a combination of feminine and masculine. This is active, this is passive, this is feminine, this is masculine. Whereas you don't have that in the I Ching.
mm,
The I Ching
mm,
it's a zeros and ones, and then you build and you code something from this binary code. But we are all non-binary because we have to have all of that to be in one. So I
mhm,
find that,
mhm. Yeah, interesting perspective on that. Yeah. Okay. Question from Kelsey. Do you think the statistical differences between Yarrow-Stock method versus other methods that give a more regular distribution of probabilities affect the tone of the oracular process with the I Ching? Or is this really even noticeable given the spiritual influences involved in the process?
So the spiritual, like the idea, the metaphysical presumption for why certain numbers are the way they are in, for example, the Yarrow-Stock method is slightly different from why we say the 3-coin toss method works. So in the 3-coin toss, like I try to explain that in the book, the way we say why 3 shows up, why 6 shows up, it's a little bit different. And even the image and number versus the meaning and principle tradition of 3-coin toss is different. Like one is based on, oh, well, this literally looks like it can't change, so it's a fixed line. This has changing lines, so it is a changing line. Like it's that
Yeah.
literal. Whereas the
Yeah.
other one is about statistical probability, and that's how you get the correspondences. And so I think it's more about like how you want to approach it. And so I wouldn't say like I do think there is a difference though. So I think what you're accessing in terms of, I guess, the spirit presence when you're using the coin toss method versus Yarrow-Stock versus the plum blossom method of counting rice grains, it's all pretty different. And even like when for example, I love using the tarot to do an I Ching divination, but that feels very different. Like the
Sure.
feeling I get is a very different vibe. And so I think, yeah, it's spiritually, the tone is definitely different.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Question from Samson. What does it feel like when you become a vessel compared to normal fortune telling?
I feel like when you're doing divination, when my intention is to invoke, and I will specify and name what spirit entity I'm invoking in order to answer the question that I have presented. In that sense, every time I'm asking the question, I'm kind of like merging my consciousness with something that is coming in to me, like from somewhere. And it can come this way too, depending on the spirit entity, right? Which way it's coming into you. And then as it merges, every single time you layer deeper into the divination method itself, the mind is merging as well. So the first time I feel myself very much present, I'm asking the question, and then by the 4th or 5th time I can feel like it's like there's something that changes and how you're present in the moment. And then once you get, and I often find that I forget how it happened. Like that happens a lot where
Yes.
you have that amnesia,
Yes.
like, I don't know how I got here. And then now you have a reading,
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know what happened, right? Whereas I
Right.
think with fortune telling, I'm really activating my knowledge. I'm activating my experience. A lot of us enjoy forms of psychic training. So I can feel myself exercising the muscles I have been training over the years and decades. And I'm never not present. All of it is
Hmm.
coming from me and coming from experience. So it's a little different. And also with the reading is different. So I think sometimes if it's more fortune telling, readings can feel more by the book. This is even with tarot. Whereas
Oh,
when
yeah.
it's divinatory, it can be really off the range that you get, but it can make
Yeah.
sense once you see the logic, but like it can be a little off range in terms of what's coming through. So that's how I can
Yeah.
tell.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I experienced that, I was really taken aback because, I very often do not remember the reading
Mhm,
at all.
mhm.
Like I know I was there,
Yep.
but I can't remember. And then people will come to me like 3 years later and they'll be like, and you said this was the card and this is what you said about it. And I was like, I don't know where that came from, and yeah. So it's fascinating.
And what's
Question.
funny is
Yeah.
sometimes if it's mediumship, when you are
Yeah.
delivering the reading, you actually have the same like mannerisms as, for example, the person's dead loved one. And they will tell you, wow, you're using the same like verbiage and tone, and
Yeah.
even your mannerisms are starting to mimic who was supposed to have come through. How did you do
Yeah.
that? Like it's so.
I know. How does that happen? I mean,
Yeah.
I talked to a medium once who channeled my grandmother, and this medium was not Chinese, and she was like, she keeps trying to give me these things in red envelopes to give you. I'm like, yeah. Yeah,
And it has
that's
a
her.
dollar in there.
Yeah. Okay. Can you say more about how to read the changing lines in a reading and what do they mean? That was one of my questions. So, thank you, Anonymous. Yes.
So I guess. Because it's the book of change, the idea is what the divination, what are you you're asking something that you don't know the answer to. And so usually it's a point of uncertainty. And so it's something in flux, something that hasn't changed into what it needs to change into yet. So something like in motion. And because it's in motion with our human minds, we can't understand it. We don't know where it's going to go necessarily, how the cards will fall. And so there's that sense of uncertainty, which has brought us to the divination table to begin with. And so you want to read that changing line because that's how you see where it's going to go. And so there's this idea, it's kind of like acupuncture, where we believe that if you see certain points, it alerts you to something else that's happening in the body. So something happening within the closed universe of the 384 lines, which are the 60, you know how it's 64 hexagrams, but if you do 64 times 6, it's actually 384 possibilities. And so that is kind of like an acupunctural table for what is happening in the universe at large. So that's kind of where that synchronicity idea might come from. And so that's the reason you look at just the changing lines. But that's also only one approach. There are multiple approaches. And I think that's the one thing lost in the West is that you have very specific authoritative texts from the Qing dynasty, which is the most recent of the dynasties that gets imported over because it was the Wilhelm edition, you know, that gets imported over to the West. And we think that this is the one and only way to divine with the I Ching. But if you understand that, if you actually look at Chinese history, there's so many robust debates and controversies over what's authentic, what's not, what's the correct way. And then ultimately the decision is that, well, there's different schools of thought. There's different lineages and different traditions, but that gets lost in the West for some reason.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's only so much that we can absorb in the West.
Right.
Here's a question from Laura. Can you explain the system of lines you described, especially lines 4 and 5 in the reading you did for me?
I think I based it off of Susie's divination. So Susie did the reading, right?
Yes,
so she
I
did
did
the
the reading.
operation.
Yes.
And then if you tell somebody the primary hexagram and the transformed hexagram, you know what the changing lines are, right? Like, because it's just, yang becomes yin, yin becomes yang. So I immediately know that because hexagram was 31, that changed
31,
to 15. So because I knew 31 changed it to 15, you can immediately pinpoint what the changing lines are. And so I zone in on those two changing lines, 4 and 5.
And in her text, Benebell breaks down line by line what you would expect to see in each hexagram, or what is associated with each line in each hexagram. A question from Mark. In your research, did you find any relationship or influence between the I Ching and geomancy?
I have no idea what geomancy is. Like, I really is it feng shui? Is that what people mean when they say
geomancy?
or are they talking about like the dots?
It's also a binary system. It's dots, right?
Yeah,
that
dot
dots
system
that you're doing kind of randomly, but you derive them also from an odd and even basis like that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know historically the context, but I see real similarities in the way, in the methodology. Yeah. A question from the Astrology Podcast. Hello, Astrology Podcast. In your exploration of the I Ching, do you feel like you've learned anything about the nature of divination that has made you understand other divinatory traditions like astrology better?
Well, according to our theory, I Ching corresponds with astrology. And so there's even the yin and yang lines themselves. They chart the 4 equinoxes and solstices. They chart the Chinese lunar solar calendar, which is pretty scientific because it's not like it's our own calendar system. It's the lunar part are the moon phases. And then the solar part, it's the Deccan rulers. That's why our original calendar had 10-week. So a week was 10 days. And that's because of if you see the whole signs chart, you know exactly what the traditional Chinese lunar solar calendar was. And so that was believed to be associated with the I Ching. The I Ching is not 64 like linear hexagrams. It's actually a circle. And so when you see original diagrams of the I Ching, it's always cast as a mandala. And that mandala it superimposes over the way we would cast a chart in terms of astrology. And so we absolutely tie and tether I Ching and astrology together. And every single one of the Hexagrams corresponds with a moment in time. And so you have like the lunar solar calendar and the correspondences to all of the hexagrams. Certain hexagrams form like the 4 points, like the 4 fixed points. So, oh, this hexagram corresponds with the spring equinox. This hexagram corresponds with the winter solstice. And so absolutely connected.
And is there, endless debate over which correspondences would go with which, the way there is like other correspondence systems? Like, are there fights over which, hexagram ought to go with this equinox versus this one?
Yes, there are, but there seems to be 2 main schools of thought on that seem to have prevailed over the millennia, and it's
Mhm.
really interesting how they correspond. So very quickly as I can, one system is saying, for example, because it's winter and it's cold, you need fire. And so the way you're doing the system is to actually preemptively or proactively bring in fire and warmth to navigate the winter month. And then if it's
Mm.
too hot, you might have drought. And so you need water and cool energy to make sure it doesn't get too hot and too dry, where you will actually have a drought. And so then the system of correspondences is the polar opposite to counteract whatever nature is doing. And that's called sort of like the magician's calendar, the
Oh, I
magician's
see.
system.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
most occultists will use that system. And then the other system is just a restatement of nature. So if it's cold, it's cold. If it's hot, it's hot. If it's light, it's light. If it's dark, it's dark. And that's how
I
the
see.
correspondence systems work. And it's just a reflection of what you actually see in nature. So those are the
I
two
see. Yeah.
systems of correspondences
Well,
that
that is
have
kind of interesting.
kind of
Huh.
risen.
Cool. Okay. Question from Eric. These different methods seem to have different chances for changing lines. How important is that difference?
I think they're just different equations. You know how like even in science and physics class back in our school days, to get to to figure out something, there are multiple
Hmm.
equations and multiple formulas you can use to arrive at the same to solve the same problem. And so I think this is the same way where you have different formulas, different equations that can solve the same problem. Yes, the formula itself is going to be very different, but the premise is the same. It's all based on probability.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think that it's also true with divination systems generally that, you can argue over the which school of interpretation you use. You can argue even over which divination system you use, and yet you will always find the answer you need. The
Mhm.
oracle is always correct. That is the premise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Question from Kelsey. How does the I Ching relate to Chinese astrology? And do you recommend any authors or teachers for Chinese astrology who are engaged with this relationship with the I Ching and other elements of Chinese esoteric and magical practices?
Not in English. I know in Taiwan, yeah, like not a dime a dozen. That's not a fair thing
Your
to say,
next
but like
book, maybe?
maybe. I mean, you're gonna see it a lot and then even in Chinese, there's the Bazi Chudo, like there's purple star astrology, there's Bazi, there's many different types of astrology as well. And so I don't know of any in English that offer classes.
Alas.
Alas,
But,
sorry.
I mean, life is long and knowledge spreads quickly. So who knows? Maybe in a year or two or 5 years, 10 years, who knows?
But I do have
Question.
correspondence tables. So in the I Ching book, and actually
Yes.
they're free downloads, to be honest, like I put them as free image file downloads off my website that has the Chinese astrology correspondences to the I Ching. So you can already download that. So it's already available.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to just getting the data, it's there.
Yes, the data is
We
there.
all need help with interpretation, but the data is there.
Yeah.
And of course, now AI can do interpretation.
I haven't tried it yet. I should try it with the each. I haven't
I
tried it.
use the Elsewhere app for dream interpretation. It's amazing, actually. Quite fantastic. Question from Serpy. I was gifted an oracle of Wong Tai Sin. I don't know the correct tones for that. Looking at the explanations for the cards, it reminded me a lot of what I've seen for the I Ching. Are you familiar with it? If so, is it connected to the I Ching?
From the spelling, it looks like that's Cantonese, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that doesn't look like Mandarin. So I think because it's Cantonese and I don't speak Cantonese, I would really need to know what the Mandarin translation of that is. I'm sorry.
Okay. All
It's
right.
probably, but there are lots of divination systems out there. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And a question from Nick. This is a wonderful question, actually. Can anyone be a vessel?
yes, but is that the way we both answer it?
No, yes, and.
Oh, yes, and yes, and yeah, yes, and well, if you're going to take a very traditional, like textual, people love to see what was cited in Zhou Dynasty text. We recently read a book, and it was from the Zhou Dynasty that talked about how you can be a vessel for divination. Like one, the astrological timing for the question presented needs to be aligned a particular way. You have to sort of set the throne for the, you know, the divine or spirit to come through. You know, you have to consecrate the place, and then you also, they even said you had to fast. Like there needed to be
Yes.
fasting involved as
Yes.
well for a particular amount
Yeah.
of time. So you can be a vessel, but like I said earlier, I mean, I think the basic fundamental philosophy is you have to be a clean vessel. So the best way I would say is, what does that mean to you? What does purification and consecration mean to you? And then put in your best efforts, your best good faith, sincere efforts to be a clean, purified, consecrated vessel for the divine to be present, to present itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, your best effort, because none of us is perfect, you
Mhm.
know. And I think as a person who, like Benebell's been doing divination for years, my experience is that, you know, it's kind of a spectrum. When you're in better shape, you get better, clearer readings, and when you've just, you know, had half a bottle of wine, you get less clear readings, you know.
I
But
will say some of my best readings came when I was drunk off my hoo-ha. So I don't
well, you know,
know.
I've heard that too, but you know, I get migraines if you look at me funny. So so and I cannot do readings with a migraine, but I've heard of that, of people, you know, doing amazing readings in an altered state. Anyways, that's a fun note to end on. Guys, this book is phenomenal, as you know, as you would expect of anything that comes from Benebell. But this is, if you have any kind of curiosity about the I Ching, this definitely belongs on your bookshelf. I recommend, I don't even know if it comes in an ebook, but I would recommend the hard copy, because, you know, it is something you're going to live with, you're going to want to have around, and you're going to use as a reference. So thank you so much, Benebell, for putting this out into the world and for being here with me this evening. It's been wonderful.
Thank
Really
you,
wonderful.
Susie. It was my pleasure. Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.